It ain't no blue ribbon. Leo Clinton Adams. August 1990. Acknowledgement. A very, very special thank you to Fern. Without her hidden abilities as a cryptographist, this would never have been done. Also, thank you for the hours you spent typing and putting it into the computer to run off the copies of it. I don't know how you did it. I can hardly read my writing when it gets cold. Your willingness to do all of this with the schedule you keep was above and beyond the call of duty, and I am very grateful and deeply appreciative. I love you very much, Dad. There were a lot of the questions asked in the pamphlet that were almost impossible for me to answer. There has been so much progress made since my childhood days in so many ways. We are, my generation, often heard to make the comment, "Those were the good old days," that I sometimes believe we have forgotten that a lot of it was not all that good. I thought I would try to write something about the way I recollect the good, bad, and otherwise. It will not always be in chronological order nor completely authentic. Memory can play tricks on you. Along with this, I will give you some copies of the paper that was printed the closest to my birthday. The only paper we had was a weekly. I was born August 29, 1920 in the community of Harmon, Arkansas. The house where I was born has been gone for many years. I don't remember of ever seeing it. The community gets its name from the school located a mile or so from my birthplace. The schoolhouse still is there, and a group of people living in the area have formed a group to restore it, which is progressing fairly well. It is located on Highway 62 about 10 to 15 miles east of Harrison, Arkansas, nearly 300 miles from Kansas City, Missouri. My first recollection of events was when I was 2 or 3 years old. We had moved from my birthplace to an area known as the Flat Rock School Community on a farm known as the Sco Place, not sure of the spelling. I can recall riding on Dad's cotton sack. All cotton was picked by hand. You hung a cotton sack which was rather long, 5 or 6 feet, over your shoulder due to the fact that cotton was so light that even when the sack was full, it didn't weigh very heavy. I also remember we had an old gander that liked to chase me. I couldn't run too well as I was overweight. I was called Cub then. In fact, Dad wanted to name me that, but Mom wouldn't let him. It was at this farm that my brother, Ed, was born and died. I don't recall anything about him. Another incident happened at this farm that created some excitement. There was supposed to be a panther roaming the area. I remember one night when all the cattle ran into the barn. Dad said he heard him howling. As far as I know, nothing more was heard of it. From the Sco Place we moved about 1/2 mile to a farm known as the Holder Place, which was located on Crooked Creek and had quite a lot of bottomland on it, which normally was richer than upland, so you would expect better crops. Mostly what I recall about this place was that we had a mail carrier, a woman, Mrs. Hawkins. She delivered the mail in a horse-drawn buggy, and in cold weather she would put hot bricks, covered with a rug, to keep her feet warm. She would stop every so often at someone's house to reheat them. We had a cotton patch, a good one, and Dad was afraid the boll weevils would get in and ruin it, so he went to Harrison, about 15 miles, and got a bunch of empty Coke bottles. He would fill them with kerosene, we called it coal oil, put wicks in them and burn them at night. I don't recall whether it worked or not. One spring, after the rains and high water, the snakes, water moccasins, would come out to sun themselves, and people would come with their .22 rifles and hold target practice on them. We had a torrential rain and Crooked Creek got away out of its banks. Some people had been cutting trees just up the creek from us and had cut a fairly large sycamore tree, trimmed the limbs off it, and left it laying on the ground. When the waters went down, the tree was balanced on the stump. Everyone thought it was really something to see. We lived on a farm that was located on 62 Highway just about a mile west of the turnoff for Alvey, Arkansas. The house was still standing in August of 1988. This was one of the few places where we lived that we had enough room. This was the place where we lived when Dad went to Oklahoma to work in the mines when crops were laid by. The term laid by was one the farmers used to mean all the cultivating of the crops was done and you just had to wait for them to mature and be ready for harvest. This time was normally used to get your winter wood cut, repair fences, and sometimes to get an extra dip or two in the old swimming hole. Also at this location, someone before us had taken a wheel from a tractor or something, mounted it on a post sunk into the ground, and I could get it to spinning on the post and then jump on for a ride. One time, at this farm, my older brother, Fred, and I found a bumblebee's nest in an old stump, so we got some hay and kerosene and covered the entrance and set it afire, Sure was a lot of buzzing from them, but we killed them. Also at this location, we had some neighbors named McMillan. Just an old man and 2 sons. One winter, we had quite a large snow and we kids had concocted us some crude sleds from junk lumber and were having quite a time riding them down a hill in the pasture. One of the old man's sons, Earl, was watching, and I suppose he thought it was fun, so he goes home and gets a rocking chair. He would sit down and rear it back and some of us would give him a shove down the hill. I don't recall how well the chair stood up, but it was fun while it lasted. While living at this place, Mr. McMillan got a croquet set, the first one any of us had seen, cleaned off his barnyard and set it up and invited us for a game. When it came my turn, I went from peg to peg without stopping, a feat which I never accomplished again. I got into trouble once for some reason and Mom was going to whip me, so I started running. I knew she couldn't catch me, so she sent Fred after me and he was getting too close to me and I saw a ditch about 8 to 10 feet wide and just one barbed wire across it and, not wanting him to catch me, I just ran across on the barbed wire, and he was not that foolish, so I got away temporarily, which meant when I did go to the house, the whipping was just that much harder. As the saying goes, you can run but you can't hide. We lived about a mile or so from a small town called Alvey. I was down there once with some other boys in a store operated by an old man who was almost blind. One of the other boys took the cover from a button on his overalls and covered it with a piece of tinfoil, and it was almost a duplicate of a dime, so he took it to the old man and bought 10 sticks of chewing gum. I thought if he could, so could I. I tried it and it worked, but I only got a few steps from the store and waited until the other boys had gone and took it back to him. I just couldn't keep it. This and one other incident was the extent of my life of crime. The other incident was when I was 6 or 7 years old and Mom sent me to the house for some reason or other. When I walked into the house, there were 2 or 3 pennies lying on the table, so I picked them up and put them in my pocket and went home. I don't recall what story I concocted for Mom, but whatever it was, she didn't believe it and she sent me back with them and told me to apologize to the lady. I knew I had to do it, for she would ask her about it, and she stood out in the road and watched me go. Needless to say, I did more standing than sitting for a while. That was one of the hardest things for me to do. It's always hard to have to apologize for our actions. From this place, we moved about a mile up the road to a smaller, but a much nicer, place called the Bill Johnson Place. While we lived here, my younger brother, Estelle, got sick for quite a while, and when he was over it we had to teach him to walk again. We would put a quilt on the floor and some of us would get on the corners with him in the middle and reach our hands out to him and help him walk to us. We thought it was fun, but I doubt if he did. Also, while at this place, my sister, Elva, pushed a green bean up her nose and it started swelling, and all our efforts to get it out failed, so we got one of our neighbors that had a car to take her into Harrison to the doctor. It is odd how a youngster can be affected by events. What I remember most about the incident was that the guy with the car had an exhaust whistle on it and the way he could get all sorts of sounds from it. While living on the Johnson Place, Dad traded for a fiddle from one of our neighbors by the name of LaFoon. I don't know what the trade was, but I sure had a lot of fun with that fiddle down through the years. A lot of times, in the evening, Dad would play the fiddle and Mom would sing. One of the songs I recall was a very sad one called "The Baggage Coach Ahead." Mom had a very good voice and could even read notes for music, and sometimes in the summers there would be a singing teacher come and give lessons in the school. I think at some time or other all of us kids were exposed to it. They would normally pay for it with chickens or some other swap of some kind. This was also the way we would pay for a paper or a magazine. The only paper I can remember us getting was one they called The Grit, which was still being published, I believe, into the 1980s. A few times we would also have a subscription to the Capper's Farmer, which I believe was printed in Topeka, Kansas. While on the subject of reading material, I don't believe people understand how we all felt about it. Every child I knew just couldn't wait until they could read. It was something you just felt like you had to do, and once you could, then it began to be a battle to find something new to read. I know I would be walking down the road, and if I saw a piece of paper hanging in the fence or a bush, I would get it, read it, and then take it home for the others to read. When somebody in the neighborhood would somehow get a book, it would make the rounds of all the homes so everybody could read it. There were no libraries in the schools. I can remember when we would get a new book, everybody would hurry through supper and gather around the table or stove, and Mom would read it aloud. I remember 2 of the books were Chip of the Flying U and The Vehement Flame. Mom had a good voice for reading, and by listening you could build all sorts of air castles. Even now it bothers me when I see reading material abused, and I still love to read. While living at the Bill Johnson place one spring, just as the corn was coming up, we had an extremely wet spell and a lot of the new corn was washed out of the ground, and Dad was afraid it was getting too late to replant, so he got his parents to come and help replant even though it was muddy. This is one of the earliest times I can remember seeing them. It was also the first time I saw corn planters. It was a device you would push into the ground, squeeze a handle which would open up the jaws in the ground, and you would drop 1 or 2 grains of corn in it and release the handle as you pulled it out of the ground, which would let the dirt drop in the hole and cover the grains of corn. All the times before, we would drop the grains by hand and cover with your feet or a plow. One spring while still at this farm, a man pulled his car into a vacant field across the road from our house and spent several days camping, which aroused the neighborhood's attention because cars were a rarity and also camping out like that was very unusual. Everybody's imagination ran wild as to who he was, what he was doing there. I don't remember whether Dad or anyone else went to talk to him or not. If they had, it might have stopped all the things that you could imagine he was involved in. One other event occurred while at this location which you youngsters will find unusual. A family came up the highway one day in some type of an old rattletrap of a car which just reached the end of its rope and gave up. They were on their way to, I believe, Oklahoma. I don't recall anything about how they got it, but they continued their trip in a covered wagon. Youngsters now have all sorts of games to amuse themselves with. You hardly ever found any type of toy to be used for enjoyment, so you improvised. I recall one time a bunch of us boys, probably of ages from 5 or 6 to 15 to 20 years of age, took the chassis of a broken down one-horse buggy, removed the part that you fastened the horse to pull it, and removed the seats and practically all except part of the running gears, took baling wires and twisted them together, secured one end to sticks to hold in your hands, attached one to each side of the front axle so to be able to steer it, and head it down the road across the highway from the house. The hill was close to a mile long, with a few level spots in it. We would give it a shove and everyone would climb on for a wild ride. At the foot of the hill the road made an abrupt turn to the left, and we would always be going too fast for the turn, so we would head across some railroad tracks and up an incline towards a house until it stopped. Then we had to turn it around and push it back up the hill before we could do it again. I don't know what would have happened if we would have met a wagon coming up the hill, as we had no brakes of any kind. Dangerous living. The first day I started to school, I was in the 1st grade and my teacher's name was Miss Ingram. When I went home she gave me a note for my folks and told them to get me the books for the 2nd grade that I was finished with the 1st. Too bad I couldn't have kept my scholastic abilities farther on than I did. There was 2 of us in the 2nd grade, and sometime after Christmas, the other boy got sick and had to miss school for a while. I didn't want to go on without him, so I went back over everything and then went through the reader memorizing everything. I still remember some of the poems to this day. This was at the Flat Rock School, which has been gone for years. One day at school, there was an odor that the teacher could not seem to locate. After a lot of searching, she discovered one of the boys had a rotten lizard in the bib pocket of his overalls. He said he could not smell a thing. The school houses were not just used for school. They were community buildings, church buildings, and occasionally used for what were called literary or debating groups. Dad always liked to get a debating society going, and one of the most favored topics was the pros and cons of freeing the slaves. I don't recall any of the specific arguments for or against the issue. Dad would also try to start a Sunday school if there wasn't one organized, and many times would be the superintendent. But he would never let them use literature, just the Bible. On occasions, there would be church service if some itinerant preacher came through the area. I remember walking to and from church at Flat Rock at night when I was 4 or 5 years old. Dad would be carrying a lantern, and the shadows of my legs would make me look almost as tall as he was. One time, I believe it was Halloween, a group of the older boys took a buggy to pieces, got them up in the belfry. Yes, the schoolhouse had a belfry and a bell, some way and down into the building, and reassembled it crossways of the doors and climbed back out the belfry. School was somewhat late getting started the next day. Nobody knew anything about how it was done. While attending the Flat Rock School, I got my first car ride. My sister Eva and I were going to school together and were less than 1/4 mile from school when a fellow by the name of Looper stopped and picked us up. Later I have thought how odd it was for a man who spent most of his life working on autos to not recall anything about the car except the smell of juicy fruit gum in the car. How many of you can remember your first car ride? We moved to a farm up the hill south of Alvi, and my sister Eva and I got up in the attic and found rolls of strips of material cut like they were made to be used for a rug. We had lots of fun with them. We could spend hours making all sorts of stuff out of them. We had a fairly large pond that had a diving board. We almost lost my oldest brother, Ralph, there one time. He was old enough that he liked to impress the opposite sex, and one time there was a group there and he dived into the pond and went too deep and got stuck in the mud and had to be pulled out and have the mud cleaned off of his face. It was a close call for him. I wonder how good an impression he made. While living at this place, Eva and I turned the wagon loose and it ran down the hill and into the corner of the barn. Dad did not appreciate that and demonstrated that dislike to us very plainly. While living on the Alvi place, we made the first overnight visit that I can recall. We went to visit my Aunt Addie and Uncle John Martin. He was my mom's brother. It wasn't very far, less than 10 miles, but you don't move very fast in a wagon. Sometimes the road was the long way, so Dad would just cut across. How he knew how to miss the fences I never did find out. It took the larger part of the day. They visited that night and we came home the next day. It was quite a trip. There was very little visiting done other than in your community. If it was very many miles, you could not make the trip and return the same day, and an overnight visit was a hardship on both families due to the small size of most houses and the normally large size of the families. You might live within 15 to 20 miles from friends or relatives and not see them for years. While living at the Alvi place, I had my first smoke. There was a weed that grew foliage on it that when it matured had clusters of foliage that grew into a sort of string-like form, and you rolled it. We would use any kind of paper we could find but preferred brown paper, crumble it and make you a cigarette out of it. It was called rabbit tobacco. We thought we were really doing something. Another incident while we were living at the Alvi place was my first circus. It wasn't large and the only animal I can remember seeing was an elephant. I thought that was something, especially when they would make him sit on a stool. While living at the Bill Johnson farm, we began to fall on hard times. Up until this time, we were fairly well equipped. We had a wagon and team, some farm equipment and enough cows and hogs for our use, but a combination of sickness and bad crop years began to take its toll and we had to start selling off livestock and equipment, and Dad was never able to recoup to any degree. The team we had was 2 mules named Kate and Rhoda. They were a good team, good workers, and fairly large. One of them, I don't recall which, had a bad habit. When she was in her stall and you went in to put the bridle on, she would come up just like you could just slip it on, and just as you reached to do so, she would whirl and kick both hind feet right at you. I've seen her peel the side of the door right by Dad's face. He knew what to expect and I never saw her kick him. Once she did this, she would turn back around and you could go ahead and put the bridle on. When I was 7 years old, we lived on what we called the Dutch Young Place, which was near Alvi and also still in the Flat Rock School District. This is where we lived when I took the pennies from the lady. I mentioned that you made things to play with. While at this farm, a group of neighborhood kids went out in the woods behind the barn and cut down a tree, probably 8 to 10 inches in diameter. It was cut somewhere around 3 feet above the ground, then some 6 to 8 inches from the top of the stump we sawed into 2 to 4 inches of center, all the way around, then chipped out the gnawed part and by using an axe we formed a fairly round post. Next we trimmed all limbs off of the tree, and then, by various testing and trying, we found the approximate balancing point of it. Of course we had no drill to make a hole through it, so we found us a piece of round metal somewhere. We built a fire and would heat the iron and begin to burn a hole through the log. When finished, we had a hole through the log that the spindle we had formed on the stump would go through. We then lifted the log up and put it down over the spindle after coating the hole and spindle with axle grease. After clearing out the underbrush, we could spin the log on the spindle, get it to going and everyone swing on it and ride. It took almost the entire year to make. We called it our Flying Jenny. I have no idea where we got the name from. I often wondered whatever happened to it. I thought it was quite an invention. In those days the farmers had a threefold plan. The first one on the priority list was to grow foods for the family to last from one crop to the next, then came food for the livestock, and then, if you had space and time left, you would try to grow what you called your money crop. There were some things you had to buy such as clothes, salt, sugar, coffee, etc. In our area, most people raised either tomatoes or cotton, more cotton than tomatoes. If you didn't live close to a tomato cannery, it had to be cotton for it would not spoil if you didn't get it to the gin immediately after. Picking. In most cases, when we had cotton it was an overnight trip to the gin. One item we always tried to raise was a good crop of peanuts. Everybody liked them and we knew they were good for us. I recall one spring something happened to our seed. I don't know what it was, weevils or something. Anyway, some one of us, I believe it was my brother, Fred, came up with 2 peanuts. No plants were ever watched closer nor tended any better than they were. We didn't have many to eat that year, but we had enough seed to plant more the next year and begin to build back. While living at the Dutch Young place one year, I followed Dad as he was plowing corn. I would fill my overall pockets with dock seeds, a weed that is totally worthless as far as I know and one of the hardest there is to kill out, and as I walked behind him, I would sow the seeds in the furrow left from the plow. The next year, I was old enough to pull weeds and I believe every one of those seeds came up, my aching back. When we were living in the Flat Rock district, Dad wanted to plant a patch of cotton right near the school and he decided the ground needed limed. In those days, if you needed lime you didn't just go buy it, in fact I don't know whether you could have found any to buy, so him and his brothers and grandpa, his dad, decided to make a lime kiln, and the way they did it was to find a limestone cliff of flat rocks, then they cut logs and made a bed, seemed to me like it was 20 to 30 feet long and 15 to 20 feet wide. They rolled the logs in place leaving a foot or so between each log, filled in that space with brush and small bushes, then hauled the flat limestone rocks in and placed on top of the logs. Then they made another layer in the same way. I believe they made 4 or 5 layers like this, then set it afire. Seems to me like it burned for a month or so. When it was burned down, you had lime and ashes. Both were good for the soil. Then they hauled it in wagons to the field and spread it out. This lime kiln was at Harmon, about 1/4 mile from Harmon. School on the road to Zinc, on the farm where my grandparents lived, Adams. I believe Aunt Delia and Uncle Thelbert were both living at home. They also had a mill located across the road from the house where they ground corn and such for feed and also ground some into meal. The grinder was operated by a small gasoline engine. The philosophy of most farmers was that first on their priority list was to raise food for the family, enough to last from one harvest to the next. Second on that list was to raise food for the livestock, and third, if there was time and space, was to have a money crop, for there were items needed that could not be grown in our part of the country. This money crop was usually tomatoes. Normally you would try to have new ground for them, which meant you cleared off all the timber on a tract of land that had never been cultivated. There was a lot of work involved. The ground had to be plowed after it was cleared off, which was a hard job due to all the roots from the trees that had been cut down. Then the rows were laid off and the tomatoes were set out at about 30-inch intervals, and water had to be hauled to the field, for every plant had to have about a couple of cups of water on it. This was a time when the entire family got involved. Plants had to be dropped to be set out and the water carried to every plant. That, I believe, was the most back-breaking job on the farm. As the plants grew, they had to be cultivated, weeds pulled out of them, and the sprouts which sprang up from the stumps and roots from the trees which had been cut. If there was sufficient rain late in the summer or early in the fall, the tomatoes would be ready to pick. You had crates which would hold about a bushel of them. As you picked them, you would stack about 4 rows of the filled crates in a row, and the wagon would come along and you would load the crates onto it. I don't recall how many crates to a load, but I would suppose 30 or 40 of them. The wagon would take them into the canning factory where they would be sorted over, weighed, and you would receive a receipt to be cashed later. If there was a good crop, every woman who could work could usually get a job peeling tomatoes. I recall one year while I was at S0 and working in the factory there, the factories at home were only paying $8 per ton, and the sorter, or checker, would really cull them out. Sometimes the farmer would take back a good portion of them and feed them to the livestock. This was during the Depression years and the factories didn't have that good of a market for the canned products. There were several years when my hometown of Piatt, Arkansas had 2 canning factories. Speaking of tomatoes and canning, one of the years while I was working in the factory at S0, we had a farmer that lived between Branson and Springfield that the man from the railroad convinced to try an experiment. He dug a fairly large pond at the top of his tomato patch to be used for irrigation. I believe the farmer told me he only had about 3 acres. He kept the weeds cleaned out until it started getting hot. Then he just let them grow to shade the tomatoes. When it didn't rain often enough, he would use his pond and irrigate them. When they were ready to pick, he and his wife would be in the field by sunup. they picked each one separately and very carefully placed them in the crate. They were all fancy ones. I saw a lot of them that one would fill a number 2 can. We were paying him $14 per ton when the factory at home was only paying $8 per ton. He told me when he brought the last load in that he had made more off his crop that year than ever before, and he had raised tomatoes all his life. That was the first time I had heard of the uplands being irrigated, although we were irrigating our level fields at S0. I often think today when you hear of all the fertilizers and chemicals the farmers now use and seem to think they must have, of how the only fertilizer that was used then was what was called commercial fertilizer, and it was only used on tomatoes. No pesticides or chemicals were used to keep the weeds and sprouts cleaned out, that was done by hand. The only other form of fertilizer was manure from the stock you had. Other than the factories, in season, there were not many places you could get a job. We had no other industries. Some of the larger landowners would hire a few people off and on. The railroad had about 3 or 4 men that worked steady called a section crew. They were responsible for the upkeep of so many miles of railroad. There was some timber work done. We had a sawmill or 2 in the area which were usually family operated. A few men would hew ties for the railroad. One summer I worked helping a man make ties while I was in from S0 after I had my time worked out. Another summer I helped a man and his son cut stave bolts. I got 80 cents a day, went to work about 8 a.m. and would usually quit about 5 p.m. It was about 4 or 5 miles to work. I walked to and from each day. When I had to go back to S0, the man had not paid me for any of my time, so I told him to just give it to my dad and he would send it to me. Late that fall, I heard from Dad and he said the man didn't have any money for me, but he had gone to Springfield, Missouri and got a bunch of used shoes and he would let Dad pick out a pair of shoes for all the family and call it even. I said go ahead, but I never got a pair of them. Shoes are something you don't think much about now. Most people seem to almost have a pair for every day and special ones for special occasions. It wasn't that way then. Normally you got 1 pair of shoes per year and you pulled them off early in the spring and went barefoot, even to school if it was warm, and you didn't put them on until it got cold in the fall. Hardly anyone had overshoes. We would wrap gunny sacks, we called them toe sacks, on our feet when it was icy and snowy in the winter time. Normally the only guys that had low cuts or slippers were the young guys to go courting in. I recall one spring, I was 12 to 13, and somehow I had got me a pair of used slippers of which I was mighty proud, although they were very much used. One day, I had been out squirrel hunting and when I came in, I went to look for my new slippers and they weren't there. I asked Mom if she had moved them and she told me Ralph had worn them to town. That was just too much to take. He couldn't just wear my new slippers like that. After thinking about it for a while, I decided what I could do to get even. It was the spring of the year, during the rainy season, and just before the rains started, we had been sowing oats. Ralph had a new pair of slippers which he had worn only once or twice, so I put them on and went out in the oat field to see how they were coming along. When I got back to the house, I very gently took them off so as not to knock any of the mud off and put them back in their box. When he came in, I never said a thing about the shoes, but when he went upstairs, he saw his new slippers sitting there with mud all over them. I was out on the porch waiting for him. He came tearing out on the porch and was going to make me clean them up. I didn't agree. After several minutes of discussion, Dad finally broke it up, but I didn't clean the mud off them. I reminded him of that on his 50th wedding anniversary and he said he didn't remember a thing about it. Still think he owes me for a pair of slippers. Sometimes in the summer, if everything was going real good, you might be fortunate enough to accumulate enough to buy you a pair of ball shoes, sort of what would be a very light version of tennis shoes now. They cost about 40 to 50 cents. If you were that fortunate, you really strutted your stuff in them. When I was in the 4th or 5th grade, we lived on what we called the Patton Hollow Place. This is where Claude was born, and we had to go to school in town. Nobody liked that. Even in small towns, the town and country kids just didn't seem to integrate very well, so most of us plus some neighbor children decided we wouldn't go. We would just spend the days in the woods, and about once a week someone would go in to change books and catch up on the news. We thought we were getting by with it and that no one knew about it, but not long before my mother passed away, I said something about school at that time and she says, "What school? All you kids did that year was play hooky." She said she knew about it at the time but thought we were about as well off as if we had gone to school. As the song says, Mama knows, but that was the only time I ever played hooky. I never knew my grandparents on my mother's side at all and not too well on my dad's side. Mostly what I remember about my grandma was how her kitchen smelled. She had a large kitchen stove with a warmer across the top of it and usually had something in it and could make some of the best potato soup you ever ate. We weren't around them a whole lot. I just faintly recall her passing away. After she passed away, Grandpa moved in with his daughter, my Aunt Delia, until he passed away, which was in the mid-30s. My most vivid recollection of that day was watching how it affected my dad. We were taking the casket to the cemetery in the back of an open truck. It was cold and blustery and Dad rode the entire distance standing by the casket. He had no hat on and his jaws were set. He would reach down once in a while and lay his hand on the casket and a tear or two would roll down his cheeks. Dad did not normally show much emotion, and that day I changed a lot in the way I thought about him. The 30s, 1930s, were hard years for everyone in our part of the country. Year after year of drought, farmers didn't raise hardly anything. Crops will not grow without moisture. I have seen corn get up to the stage where, as they say, it is shooting and tasseling, which means it is beginning to form an ear of corn and the tops are blossoming out. The hot winds would start blowing and in a matter of a week or two all that is left is a bare stalk, which is not good for anything. Pastures were all dead, springs and creeks drying up. I have seen even the leaves on grown trees twist from the heat and loss of moisture. There weren't any jobs available, for we had no industries to create them. I very often feel like the small merchants were a special breed in those days, for I know a lot of them let people buy groceries on credit that they never got paid for. I know I paid off one bill my folks made in the 1930s after I was married. Also, in the 1950s, we took Dad back to Bergman and Harrison, Arkansas, and paid off 2 bills that had been made in the 30s. This made Dad feel real good, for he had worried about them all those years. I recall one year when we were living on what we called the Roberts Place. We had 12 to 15 acres of cotton and the ground was good enough that Dad felt like we should get about a bale per acre, which would have meant we would make good money on it. About the middle of the summer, it just stopped raining, and when it came time to pick the cotton, we got 2 bales off of it, and the last bale we got by pulling the bolls from the plants, taking them into the house and prying them apart so we could get the cotton out. So naturally it was not prime cotton and you were paid accordingly. While living on the Roberts Place, I was about 8 to 9 years of age. I was helping Dad build a shed and we were using old lumber and nails. I was trying to drive a nail in an old oak board and I was hitting all around it. Our landlord was about 75 years of age and he was sitting on a stump a few feet away watching me, and he said, "Son, if you hit it you would drive it better." I almost threw my hammer at him. While living on the Roberts Place, we got a pup, a white English bulldog female, which we kept until she passed away at 10 to 12 years of age. She was a real good hunting dog and was always ready to go hunting anytime anybody came by with a gun, day or night. I recall one time one of our neighbors came to go squirrel hunting with us. His name was Slick Marshall. Our dog treed at a tree and we couldn't see any sign of a squirrel and we were going to call her off, and he said, "Ol' Bulger wouldn't lie to us." He looked up in the tree and saw a hole and decided the squirrel was in there, so he laid his gun down and climbed up the tree and reached down in the hole, and it was there. It sank its teeth into his thumb and he sure came down that tree in a hurry, still with the squirrel hanging on. We saved him and the reputation of Ol' Bulger and got the squirrel too. The only recreation we had was what we made ourselves. One form was the Saturday night square dance, which we had occasionally. Sometimes I played the fiddle for them. If I was playing and my brother Ralph was doing the calling, I would keep stepping up the tempo and he his calling until we would have them really spinning. Very seldom was there any problems. One time we had 2 guys that had some white lightning and started trying to fight each other. But after most of the crowd kept urging them on for a while, everybody decided they weren't going to do anything and walked away. Not a blow had landed. One of them was afraid and the other was glad of it. In 1935, my older brother, Fred, went to the School of the Ozarks to work his tuition out for high school. Just before school started, he decided that instead of going to school he wanted to join the CCC, and the school agreed I could take his place if I could get my 8th grade diploma and be there by the 1st of October. I was just starting in the 8th grade, so I talked to my teacher about it and he gave me a list of questions that would be similar to what would be on the test. In those days you had to take a state board of education test to get your 8th grade diploma. I dug in and passed, got the diploma and entered high school about the 1st of October at the School of the Ozarks, 1935. The teacher's name was Cecil Underwood and school was Sugar Orchard near Piatt, Arkansas. Of all the school teachers I had in grade school, the first one and the last one are the only ones I remember the names of. I will always be grateful to Mr. Underwood for what he did for me. He knew if I didn't go to the School of the Ozarks that I would probably not go to high school at all. He was also the teacher that had the first radio I ever heard. He and his wife lived in a hotel in Piatt and they owned a battery-operated radio. On Saturday nights, they would invite a family to enjoy it with them. I think what he was trying to do was show us that there was a lot of the old world out there and we needed to get ready to face it. He was a local boy that stayed to help. Lost track of him until somewhere in the 1970s and I was visiting my brother Fred at Gentry, Arkansas, and he had found out he had a photography studio in Miami, Oklahoma. We went over to see him and had a nice visit with him. Sometimes I wonder if teachers realize just how much influence they have over their students. They can teach you a lot more than what is covered in the textbooks. I met your grandmother while at the School of the Ozarks. After graduating in the spring of 1939, we both wound up in Kansas City, Missouri and were married on the 22nd of October, 1939, and there was what was the beginning of this bunch of my, and yours, family tree. At the Sugar Orchard School, my last grade school, there was a spring about a quarter of a mile from the schoolhouse and the men in the neighborhood had built a wall around it to form a pool and laid a pipe from there to just outside the schoolhouse that ended in an upright pipe, and we had running water for the school. We thought that was really something. A bunch of us boys built some water wheels in the stream and would tie strings around them and use them to drive other ones on the bank of the stream. We thought that was quite ingenious. Once while we lived in the Sugar Orchard School District, Dad and I walked to Yellville to see about something, what I don't recall. The round trip was about 25 miles or so. We made the round trip in one day. On the way back we stopped at a store in the Snow District that was called Little Chicago. It was after dark and we still had several miles to go. We bought 10 cents worth of cheese and crackers and it was about all we could eat even though we hadn't eaten since breakfast. At this time, Arkansas had what was called free range, which meant, if you wanted to, your stock could just roam and any farmer that didn't want them in his fields would have to fence those fields. We always tried to raise a few head of hogs for meat and Dad would take them a couple of miles or so from home where the grazing was better, and on Sunday afternoons he would take a small amount of food and go where he had turned them loose and start calling them, and pretty soon they would come to him. He would give them the food and start scratching their stomachs, and pretty soon he would have hogs stretched out all around him to be scratched and petted. He would also have a bottle of coal oil, kerosene, and wipe it on them to kill the ticks. They seemed to like it. One of the first jobs I had was helping a man build a stone wall around our landlord's front yard. We dug a ditch possibly around 2 feet deep and about 6 to 8 inches wide. Then we went into the woods and found a ledge of flat rocks. We would work as large of one we could handle loose and load it onto a wagon and haul it to the yard and stand it on its side and slide it into the trench we had dug. We lined the entire front of his yard this way. It sure was hard work, but we got paid 50 cents for a day's work. We were really proud of it and I have kept track of it all these years, only now the yard has filled up well. Above the rocks we put in, other rocks have been added to hold the dirt, but nobody has stood them on their side as we did. It has been a favorite statement of mine that I never cease to be amazed that most children live to become adults due to some of the capers they get into. When I was around 10 years of age, me and some other boys would go climb bluffs when we had nothing else to do. Of course, we didn't know anything about it or safety precautions and equipment. It was there, so we climbed it. I remember one time I was going to climb down it instead of up. This is the hard way to go because you can't see what's below you like you can when you are climbing up. I had gone down possibly 20 to 25 feet when I lost my footing. But I was lucky. I grabbed hold of a sprout and it held me until they got a rope and passed it down to me and then hauled me up. Lucky they were there or you wouldn't be reading this now. Another time during the spring rains, Crooked Creek was out of its banks and it was too wet to be in the fields. I was down watching the waters roll by and I got the idea to get our horse, we called him Shorty, and ride across the creek. It took a lot of coaxing to get him to do it, but we finally went into the creek and made it across, but the hardest part was coming back across. The first time there was more excitement to keep the adrenaline flowing. Coming back there was more fear. If Dad had caught me doing that, no telling what he would have done. While we were living on the Stewart place, there were some folks living on the road which leads from Harmon to Zinc that we were friends with, but to get to their place you had to cross a swinging bridge over Crooked Creek which seemed to me to be a mile long, especially when the creek was up, but it was probably more like a couple of 100 feet across. The bottom of the bridge was made of flat boards, but a lot of them were missing and others about half rotten. I never knew of anybody falling through nor of anyone being scared to death from it. My sister, Eva, and I were going visiting once, and she was going to wear a sleeveless dress which also was cut low in the back, maybe 3 inches below the neck, but Mom wouldn't let her go like that, so when she went to change she just left it on under her other dress, and before we got there she pulled the top one off. I think her conscience bothered her though. The summer after Dad had the pneumonia, he was working over near Alvey and clearing some pasture land for a man. Ralph and Fred were both working out and I was making the crop. At the crossroads where you went down to Alvey from 62 Highway, there was a small grocery store where we had been trading. We ran a bill there, and when Dad would get paid, he would settle up with him. Mom sent me there one day to get a bag of meal for we were clear out. I rode the horse to get it. When I got there and told the grocer what I wanted, he told me we couldn't get any more until Dad paid the bill. I don't believe I have ever had anything hurt me worse or infuriate me more, for it had never happened to me before, and there was 2 or 3 men in the store, which made it more embarrassing. He also knew Dad was working and would pay him when he got paid. I still feel like if there had not been other people there, he wouldn't have done it. People can sometimes be awfully cruel. One of the hardest things I ever had to do when a youngster was one spring our bulldog, Old Bulger, had a large litter of pups, and Dad knew we didn't have any food for the mother so she could suckle the pups, so he made me take all but 1 or 2, put them in a gunny sack and throw them in the creek, which was out of its banks due to the spring rains. I could understand to a degree his reasoning, but it took me a long time to get over it. When you are barely existing, it isn't very logical to try to feed a mother dog until she can get out and hunt for her food. You would rather dispose of them than see them waste away from the lack of food and maybe lose the mother dog too. We lived on what we called the Dudd's place one time. They were the parents of my brother Fred's wife, in the Piatt area. They had a huge horse that was called Sherman. I don't know where they got the name, as it was before the Sherman tank, that several would use to break new animals to work with. He had an unusual way of calming them down when they got too frisky. Usually when you break a new animal to work, you hook them to a turning plow. This is the plow that you use to break ground preparatory to planting. You would hitch Sherman to the side where the ground had not been broken and put the new animal into the furrow. Everything would be fine as long as the new one didn't get too agitated. When it started raising too much fuss, old Sherman would open his mouth wide open, reach over and grab a mouthful of neck. He would never change his pace. He would just hold on until the new one settled down, then turn him loose and give him a chance. It didn't normally take too many times until they got the message. Sherman was so huge that he could pretty well hold them under control. Speaking of animals, the horse we had, Old Shorty, could be awfully contrary at times. He was what was called a western bronc that had been used for riding and pulling a preacher's buggy and for breeding purposes until he was 7 or 8 years of age. Then they ruined him for breeding and tried to make a workhorse out of him. I believe that once in a while he felt as if he had been treated unfairly and would just decide that he was not going to work anymore. I had come home from S0 one fall for a few days. As I was coming up to the house, Dad was carrying in a pole for wood that would have been a load for the horse. I asked him why he wasn't using the horse, and he said he couldn't get him to pull anything. This didn't set too good with me, so I caught Shorty and harnessed him up, took him into the woods and found a tree that had been blown up by the roots, larger than I would normally pull with him, but I had my dander up, and hitched him to the small end of the tree with the roots still attached, picked up the reins and told him us go. He leaned into the traces a little, turned and looked at me as if to say, "You know this is too much." The next time I told him, "Us get it," I was somewhat more emphatic. After 3 or 4 urgings from me, he finally decided I meant business and began to dig in. When he finally got it to moving, his stomach was almost touching the ground and sweat was rolling off him. Once he got moving, I wouldn't let him stop until we had it in the wood yard. I felt mean about it, but he was just on one of his stubborn streaks. I loved to work with him though, stubbornness and all. Maybe because we were both so stubborn. Dad told me once that I was so stubborn I would argue with a signpost even if I had painted it myself. In those days, especially in the country and maybe to a lesser degree in the city, farmers had to be blessed with a large dose of good old common horse sense. For example, when I had to have my leg operation, We knew I would have to be home for a while and have a set of crutches to get around with. I don't know where the money would have come from, so my dad made me a pair. He went out in the woods and found saplings. I don't know what kind they were, but they had to have grown so they would be tall enough, with no limbs, to reach the armpits, for he had split the top part of it to put the cross piece for the arm to rest on, and he had to limit the depth of the split only far enough to install the handhold and the top pad holder somehow, I have forgotten just what way, and do all of this without a drill, plain, without special tools, just a pocket knife and broken glass that he used to shape them with. They fit me good and we kept them around for years. I don't recall what finally happened to them. The plows that we used were built for either one horse or two. As a means of hooking the animal to a single plow, you used what was known as a single tree, and where you used two to a plow, you called it a double tree, and it would have two single trees attached to it. The trees themselves were made of wood with metal pieces to attach to the plow, and also metal ends with clips for attaching the trace chains from the horse's harness to. When something happened to either one, you would remove the metal parts, make a new one from a tree and reattach the metal pieces. Any holes you needed you would heat a metal rod and burn through. The metal parts could be bought, but again the problem of money arose. Also, by the time you walked into town and back, you could have the old pieces attached to your new double or single tree. They would also make the handles that were on the plows. The blades were attached to the plow by bolts and nuts, and you guarded them real close, for if one got lost or ruined, you had to buy a new one. A few of the lucky farmers had a brace and bit set, which was a hand-operated drill, and they were the envy of the neighborhood. Some farmers had a blacksmith shop where they could make and repair different metal parts. All they had for heat was a forge, but some of them were real good at their job. They could even weld some. To get the coal for the forge, they would walk the railroad tracks and pick up coal that had fallen from the train. All trains then used coal. My dad was a fair blacksmith, and it used to be my job to turn the blower that forced air through the burning coal to make it get hotter. We never had a blacksmith shop of our own, but we lived at two different places where we had access to one. Now that type of work is done by electric welders, which is a lot faster, but I doubt if it is any better. Another quite ingenious device was a hay lift to put the hay into the barn loft. Remember, there was no electricity or tractors for them to use. Dad would run a boom out from the hayloft and attach a block and tackle to the boom with a long rope attached through it. On one end of the rope, he would put a large pincer-like hook, somewhat like ice tongs. He would drop this down on a wagon load of hay with a team on the other end of the rope. When the team of horses would start pulling the rope up, the pincers would close and he could haul a bite of hay to the top. Then he would swing the load into the barn, back the team up and release the pincers. Then he was all set for another bite. One of my uncles had a spring up the road from his house which he dug out and formed a pool in. He then ran a pipe from this into a sink he had installed in the kitchen, thus getting running water in the house. The pipe had no valve on it. It ran all the time and on out the drain and outside. He was really proud of it. In the 1930s, when it was really tough for the farmers, the federal government would come into a community and set up a community cannery. It had to be situated on a water supply, for you had to have a steam boiler to cook your product before it could be sealed. It was put in metal cans and you used a hand-operated capper to seal the cans. We had one in our community, but I never saw it in operation, for it came along after I had gone to the School of the Ozarks. The people did all of the work. The government just furnished the equipment. Two other programs came along in the 1930s to help alleviate some of the hardships in the country. They were the WPA, Work Progress Administration, and the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. The WPA was used for community road work such as new roads and bridges. I believe the pay was around $2 per day, but $1 would buy a lot then. The CCC would take young men and put them in camps where they lived somewhat under military-like conditions, although the military was not involved. They would build small dams in the state parks and lodge-like buildings, roads through the parks. They also built some schoolhouses, community buildings, and larger bridges where the WPA didn't have the manpower or equipment to do it. Some of the buildings which they erected are still in use today. My brother Fred joined the CCC instead of staying at the School of the Ozarks. They got paid a small amount, but I do not recall how much. It was hard work and a hard life, but it was a way to make a living, and for some there was enough knowledge gained to go on and make a career with, and they had the respect of the people in the communities where they worked, for they had a very strict discipline. With all the electrical appliances in use today, it would be almost impossible for people to realize what it was like when there was no electricity, no running water, no automatic heating and cooling devices, and very few cars, and I believe that in the county that I grew up in, there were only 2 or 3 tractors. I remember one time when we moved we had to go to one of the neighbors and borrow fire. Our fire had gone out and nobody had matches, so we borrowed a piece of wood that was still burning and started our fire with it. Water was always a problem. We never had a place with a well on it. We had 2 or 3 that had cisterns, but there normally was not enough rain in the summer months to keep any water in them, so you carried water from the closest spring, which might be real close, or 1/4 mile or so from the house. Wash days were especially rough. Everybody hated to carry so much water. I recall one place we lived when it got real dry in the summertime. We built a sled and got hold of a couple of 55-gallon drums, and I would take the horse and pull the sled down to Crooked Creek, almost 1/4 mile, fill the barrels and sled them back up the hill to the house. This water was used for laundry, dishwashing, and for the chickens and hogs. Everyone tried to get by with as small amount of water as they could. Wood for heating and cooking was another problem. Normally when the crops were laid by, you would go into the woods and cut down trees and saw them into the proper lengths for the heating stove and cook stove, for they did not use the same length. Nobody enjoyed this, for it was the hottest time of the year and it seems to be hotter in the woods than out in the open, so it was hard to get in a correct frame of mind to concentrate on getting heating wood when it was unbearably hot. Besides the wood for the heating and cook stove, you would also accumulate a pile of kindling to be used to start fires after they had gone out. If you had a fireplace, you could use larger pieces of wood. Some of the logs you wouldn't even split, so they would burn longer. But we never had very many fireplaces. Most of the time we used what was called a king heater, which was the cheapest one you could find. They cost less than $10, and I saw one in 1988 which cost well over $100 and looked just like the ones we used to have. One bad thing about those heaters was that they would not hold fire very good overnight, so you got up in freezing temperatures if it was that cold. The houses were not built very good and no one had heard of insulation. I don't believe we ever lived in more than 2 or 3 houses that you could not see cracks through the walls. We had such a large family that if we rented a house with a porch on it and we could get the landlord's permission, we would close in enough of the porch to put a bed and 3 of the boys would sleep in it. Of course you slept with your clothes on, and if there was snow during the night, you would shake the snow off the covers when you got up. I always tried to sleep in the middle, for that was the warmest spot, and you never wanted to be the first one in bed, for just about the time you got your spot warmed up, someone would come in and freeze you all over again. It was especially bad if someone had been out somewhere and just came in and hopped into bed. I shiver now when I think about it. I believe the worst winter I can recall would have been in 1929-30. Dad came down with the pneumonia, I believe about Christmas time. We almost lost him. He was in bed for a month or so. The nearest doctor was in Harrison, some 12 to 15 miles away, and even to call him, we had to walk about 3 miles to a telephone. I don't know whether he ever came to see him, but we talked to him a time or so, and he had us to take a 5-pound bag of salt and split it in half and heat them and put them on his chest and shoulder areas and get him to drink all we could. Someone was with him all the time and you had to heat the bags of salt fairly often. I can recall very vividly when it broke loose. I was doing the heating of the bags of salt and had just finished changing them and had laid back down in front of the fireplace to read. He coughed real hard and it sounded like a .22 rifle shot, and he started coughing up the phlegm. He said later that it felt like what he thought a .22 would feel like if you were shot with it. It scared me out of my wits, but he started getting better, but it was a slow process. That winter was also the only time we ever used any assistance. The government or the Red Cross one had an allotment of food you could get, so Fred and I borrowed a mule and wagon from a neighbor and went to Bergman to pick it up. While we were there, we were supposed to send a postcard to Grandma and Grandpa Adams, who now lived in Piatt, Arkansas, and tell them about Dad being sick. When we got in the post office to send it, nobody knew how to spell pneumonia, not even the postmaster, so I had to spell it for them. By the way, the postcard cost 1 cent. I don't recall what we got in the food basket, but I do know the flour we got had chicken feathers in it. I often wonder where they came from. I would feel so sorry for Mom. She would try so hard to get a meal together. The summer after Dad had his bout with the pneumonia and wasn't really well enough to work, he walked about 4 or 5 miles to clear some ground for a man near Alvey. Ralph and Fred worked out most of the summer, Fred with Uncle Thelbert, Dad's brother, raising tomatoes, and Ralph with Uncle Henry Morton, whose wife was Dad's sister. I made the crop, me and a small horse or mule. I don't remember which. We had about 20 to 25 acres. We had some corn, cotton, peas, and the normal garden variety of vegetables. This farm was known as the Stewart Place, which some of you have been to. It was one of the less desirable ones as far as water is concerned. In the spring and early summer, if rainfall was normal, we had a spring fairly close to the house, but it would dry up in the summer months and we had to carry water about a quarter mile. They now have a well within 10 to 12 feet of the house and a pump in it and get all the water they need even for watering the yard and garden. It's maddening every time I see it. While we were living here was the one and only time that I saw Ralph drinking. I was walking through the corn one Sunday afternoon and ran across him and a neighbor boy sitting down up against a tree, and Ralph had his pocket knife out in an ear of corn. I had got some corn that had purple grains on it and he was telling the other young man, "Watch me change the color of this corn," and he would cut the tops off the grains of corn. I got onto him for cutting up my corn before it was ready. This farm was in the Bauman School District and, as of August 1988, the school building was still standing. Mike was with us when we were there and we got some boards from the building which was being used to store hay. When I was about 8 years of age, we lived on what we called the Roberts Place, which was just across Crooked Creek from the Stewart Place. This is where my brother Lloyd was born. We had some fairly good bottom land and Fred decided he would grow some watermelons and take them into Bergman to sell. He had a pretty good melon crop and he would take jars of sweetened water and drop a thread into the jar and thread a needle and stick the needle into the melon. It was supposed to make them sweeter. He got the idea someone was getting into his melon patch, so he and I would go sleep in the patch with a gun. Of course we never saw anyone and I don't know what we would have done if someone had come in, but it was exciting and different. Best I recall, he never sold a melon. Dad was rather unusual in some ways. If any of us kids wanted to clear out a space to put something special, he would let us and we could do whatever we wanted to with whatever we grew. It was while we were living on the Roberts Place that I first paid for any of my clothing myself. I picked tomatoes for a family by the name of Harris who owned a small tomato cannery, and I bought me a pair of shoes. They cost me $1.30–$1.40, I believe, and I had got about a penny or so for each crate of tomatoes. A crate was about a bushel. I was real proud of them. After obtaining my 8th grade diploma, I left for the School of the Ozarks around the 1st of October 1935. It was to be quite an adventure. To start with, it was my first train ride, which was rather exciting, and we also had to pass through a tunnel before we reached Hollister, Missouri. From the depot at Hollister, it was about 2 miles to the school and I walked to get there. I was not going into a totally alien atmosphere, for my sister, Eva, and a neighbor girl, Thelma Richardson, were already there and had been most of the summer working out their time. Maybe I should explain that statement, working out their time. In order for a student to be eligible for a scholarship, they were required to work a minimum of 540 hours in the summer months and to work 16 hours per week during school to entitle them to their board, room, and laundry. Speaking of feeling like a country bumpkin, I not only felt like one, I know I acted like one. I saw my first drinking fountain, my first electric light, my first toilet stool and shower. It was a hair-point-7 situation for me to adjust to. School was especially hard, for they were about a month ahead of me. I had never known anything except a one-room school. I had only spent a few weeks in the consolidated school at Piatt. Also, living with 3 other students in a room in the dormitory was hard for me to adjust to. I felt like everybody was watching me and it seemed to me like everything that I did was wrong. I felt that all the other students were so much smarter than I was, for they had been there longer. There were so many things to marvel at: 3 meals a day, a variety of food, all the milk you could drink, good bread, both flour and cornbread that had been made with milk, not water as ours had so often been made at home, having to go to study hall at night, going to chapel services every day at the noon break. The entire faculty were really nice people and my teachers did their best to help me get caught up on my school work, but any of you who have studied algebra will remember how important the first couple of weeks are. I not only had missed them, but I was supposed to have had an introduction to algebra in the 8th grade and I was missing that also. I had never been very self-confident nor a very good communicator, and the situation I went into at school made it even more so. I never did get to the point where I was completely at ease with a group, nor ever got to where I could hold a good conversation with them. I don't recall what my first work assignment was, but I do recall going into Hollister in the truck and hauling coal back for the power plant. The school generated its own electricity, and since the power plant was operated by steam from the boilers, we had hot water in the bathrooms. Hot water was something I had not been used to washing with. My sister, Eva, and Elva made it easier, for they were old hands by then. I also met a young lady by the name of Violet Fry who helped me over some of the rough spots. The summer after the first year of school, I began to feel more at ease. Work was something I was very familiar with. I started working for a Mr. Theodore Hirsch, or Pedro as we called him, on the campus. We had about 12 to 15 acres of lawn which I kept mowed mostly by myself with an old push mower. We also had 2 lily ponds and numerous shrubbery I had to take care of. Sometime during my first summer's work, I got switched to the farm and they put me in charge of an irrigating crew. We had acres of beans to take care of. I knew nothing about irrigation, but I went to the library and read about it. It was rather enjoyable, for we would be in the fields by sunup and irrigate 3 or 4 hours and then take off until later in the afternoon and then go out for another 3 or 4 hours. It would take us about 3 days a week to get them all irrigated, and we would spend the rest of the time keeping them cleaned of weeds and grass. When the beans were ready to pick, almost the entire school would get involved, even the teachers that were there, and Mr. Good, the president. We had our own canning factory in which we canned the beans, canned tomatoes on the shares for some of the local farmers, and even bought some tomatoes to can. I don't know how it came about, but I wound up working in the factory, first just as a sort of a gopher, then I was put in the office and had to weigh in whatever was brought in to be canned, and then to seeing that everything was properly prepared for canning, and then into operating the capping machine, which was my first experience at any kind of mechanical machine. After this, they just about turned the entire operation over to me. The manual training teacher was supposed to be in charge, but he would normally check with me in the morning and I wouldn't see him for the rest of the day unless I got stumped on something. I recall one time I had been up where all the preparatory work was being done to see how the girls were doing. When I came back to the capping and cooking department, I heard a lot of according to what we were canning. About 2 p.m., I received a call from a community cannery at Forsyth, and their boiler had broken down and they wanted to know if they brought their own caps and lids, and packers, if we could run them through and cap and cook them, so I told them to come on. They got there about 4 p.m. and we started running them through. I shut the capper down at just a few minutes before 4 a.m. Sunday morning. I had been there for over 22 hours and still had to finish the cooking. I reached the dormitory about 7 a.m. Everyone was required to attend church on Sunday morning. Pop Cave, the principal, came through checking rooms shortly after 10 a.m. but just opened the door, saw me in the bed and went on out. They did me that way a lot of times when they knew I had worked late the night before. One winter the school had a carload of grapefruit, that is freight cars. They were windfalls, ones that had fallen off the trees. We were making grapefruit juice out of them. The juice was awfully strong, so I experimented a little. I would run the juice through the steam tunnel but set the cans off before capping and set them open in a crate used for cooking. One layer was all that could be filled at a time. Then we would put the crate in a pressure cooker for 30 minutes and then open the cooker up and then seal them. That made real good grapefruit juice. Another thing that fascinated me was the library. I never knew there were that many books anywhere. There weren't many chances for boy-girl situations, but there was a growing feeling between myself and the girl who became my wife later on. My favorite subjects were what was called literature and life, then manual training and commercial law, business arithmetic, and typing. I never did make very good grades. I spent too much time working. For almost 3 years, I worked for Mr. Good, the president, after the factory closed in the fall, and it seemed like every time I had study hall, he would send for me and have me to do something for him. Maybe show some rich guy through the school, check on the food storage in the basement of the dining hall. I never knew just what it would be, but I learned a lot of extras from doing that and I didn't regret it. About the only sports activities were basketball, both boys and girls. Really, it wasn't as necessary then as it would be now, for everybody worked some every day and Monday was a work day. We had no school on Monday, but we did have school on Saturday. In the summertime when we were working out our time, about once a month or so they would let the boys go into a show at Branson if you had the money. One Saturday night, which wasn't one of the show nights, 2 other guys and I decided we would go to the show, for we had been working the night when you could go. We went across the hills and down and across the railroad bridge so we wouldn't be seen. While we were in the movie, I had to go to the restroom, and when I was going across the vestibule I saw Pedro, the man in charge of the campus crew. It was rather comical to watch him, for he didn't want me to know he had seen me, or he would have to report me and I would have had some demerits against me. He never did mention it to me. One summer there was a potato patch just across the road from the canning factory. I went out into the field after they were through harvesting the potatoes, and I saw they had left lots of small ones still in the furrows. We were running out of beans and tomatoes, so I got the idea to can the small potatoes whole and in small cans. So I got the boys and girls together and sent them out to pick the potatoes up and begin to get them ready to process, while I went to the canning book to see what the process would be. Normally all of our canning was done by using a number 2 can, which is the most common size. I didn't want to use them though. I wanted to use a smaller can which was known as a number 1. Anytime we had to do anything with the capping machine, we would call the American Can Company in Springfield and they would send a man down to do it. I contacted the office and told them what I wanted to do, and they thought it was a good idea and called Springfield for the man to come the next morning to do it, but he was out of town for a few days and they didn't have anyone else to send. That wait just didn't fit in with my plans, for they were already picking the potatoes and I had been enthusiastic about it and I couldn't back down. I contacted the manual training teacher who was in charge of the factory and told him about the problem and also my solution for it. I would change the capping machine myself. He must have had a lot of confidence in my mechanical ability, for he gave me an okay. He didn't know that the only thing I had ever done that might be called mechanical was to change plow blades. After all the rest of the crew were finished for the day, we all went into supper and afterwards I went back alone and started the changeover operation. The big item you have to worry about when sealing cans is that your seams must be absolutely airtight and fit the top of the can perfectly, or you will end up with a lot of spoilage. I had watched the man from the American Can Company adjust the pressure on the rollers that attaches the lids, so I knew a little about it. After doing the changeover and setting the tension on the rollers for sealing, I thought I was okay and went to the dormitory and went to bed. The next morning we started getting them ready. We had a boiling water bath we ran them through, not to cook them but to get them hot enough to where you could take one in your hand and squeeze and the skin would pop off of it. When you filled the can you would put a salt tablet on top and fill with water, then sit it on the chain and send it through the steam tunnel to the capping machine, then the cans would go into a pressure cooker. I was running the first ones through when the factory man walked in. He had gotten back earlier than he thought he would. When he saw I was capping the smaller cans, he wanted to know how we got the change done and I told him I did it. He looked at me sort of odd, picked up one of the empty cans I used while making my setup, filed into the seal and then took one I had just sealed and did the same to it. He told me to go ahead and run them off that. My seal was good. He asked me how long it had taken me to make the changeover and I told him about 2 hours. He congratulated me and said it usually took him at least an hour. We canned several hundred cans of small potatoes and they would use them as a special treat for the meals they served to visitors. I have thought about the work that was done at the school many times. Most of the students were as ignorant as I was about lots of the mechanical machinery the school used, and there wasn't a lot of technical supervision, for the school didn't have people trained to do that, but there was very little breakdown of equipment and I can't recall of any large problems at the factory that was caused by improper usage of the equipment. One winter, I worked at the dairy for a while. We would get there about 4:30 in the morning to get the milking done by breakfast time. I don't recall how many cows we milked, but it was all done by hand, and at one time I was milking 10 or 12 and about half were Holsteins, the hardest cows there are to milk. One winter the school decided to raise some broilers and a student, Robert Newton, and I were selected to raise them. They were day-old chicks when they arrived and we had to check on them every hour and sleep in the broiler house at night. One of us would check on them during the day after each class period. We had good luck with them. Another fall, our Bible teacher, a Dr. Bell, had the school buy 4 or 5 dozen of small hams, and he had an old family recipe for giving the Virginia ham cure. Again Robert and I were chosen to do it. We had them in the canning factory and I don't remember how many different types of wood we used to smoke them with, but that type of work we didn't mind, for there wasn't any real work connected to it. We just had to keep the smoke and heat just right. They were being prepared for special guests and I think they sent some to important supporters of the school. All of the cultivating was done by mules. One summer they erected an electrified fence around the barn lot and we had one mule that just didn't like it. Most of them learned to stay away from it, but not him. He would walk up to it and start pushing his chest against it. His ears and tail would just be flopping and switching, but he wouldn't stop until he pushed it over. Then he would step outside and start eating. Don't fence me in. The school did their own building, even had their own rock quarry. They had an engineer that worked for the school full-time and another man that was an overseer of the actual construction work itself. The engineer was a graduate of the school who had gone on and gotten his degree and then came back and went to work for them. The only hired workers the school had, other than teaching staff, was the engineer, the building superintendent, the dairy boss, the dormitory matrons, a supervisor for the kitchen, and Mr. Good had a private secretary. One year the school had raised enough turkeys for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and when we were butchering them just before Thanksgiving we did them all and put the ones for Christmas in a freezer in Hollister. When it came time to get those ready for Christmas, they got them and were cooking them in a steam cooker, and after they had been there for an hour or so, someone discovered they had not been drawn and it fell my lot to do the job. I didn't eat one bite of turkey that Christmas. My junior year I had enough seniority to qualify me for a two-man room. My roommate was Boyd Wise, also a junior and from Ava, Missouri. He was related to Violet Fry, who was to become Mrs. Leo Adams. Also in my junior year, I was chosen by the dormitory mother to be the dormitory and room checker, a job no one went out after. It wasn't unusual at all at that time to have high school students well into their 20s, for if you were from the farm there were lots of times when you should have been in school when you had to help with the crops. We had two guys that had their room on the ground floor. One of them would sneak out just before lights out to take a smoke. He would have gotten kicked out if he got caught. He would time it so he would get to his room just as the lights were turned off. One night it was raining and there was an old hound dog hanging around the dormitory, and a couple of guys went out, got him and stretched him out and covered him up. When the guy got back he just undressed, threw the covers back and jumped right on top of the dog. The roof almost blew off. He was slightly irritated. The dormitory was 3 floors tall and the showers were in the basement. A lot of the guys would come out of the showers and run to their rooms before getting dressed. There were metal handrails on the stairs. One night somebody got a magneto off of one of the tractors, rigged up a hand crank to it and attached a wire from it to the handrail. They would wait until there were guys running up the stairs and using the handrails to help them and start cranking the magneto and give them quite a shock. That would always lead to some interesting conditions. It may seem odd that so much I remember about my days at the School of the Ozarks had to do with my work. I think that is because almost everything I did was new to me, and also that I was never very much of a scholar. Also, for some reason or other, it seems like I was always being called on to see a lot of different jobs were done right. Most of the times when Dr. Good would read off the work assignments for Monday's work day, they would give a list of people who were to report to me for different assignments, which was an ego builder for me but doesn't really help your rating with other students. After I was in business for myself, I had the man who taught manual training and was my boss at the canning factory as a customer, and I asked him about that and he said they did that to some students for they knew they would see that the jobs were done right. I worked at almost everything there was to do except the power plant, electrician, plumber, or carpenter. The one place I didn't enjoy at all was in the rock quarry, and after a few days there, I managed to get moved to some other job. Each year they would have a reading contest and there would be cash prizes. I won second place. I believe it was, and my roommate won first. Violet Fry won third place. We had to read from a list of books and were required to give both an oral and written report on each book. One of the books we had to read was The Last Days of Pompeii, which has to be the dullest book ever written, so I read the first chapter, went to about the middle of the book and read a chapter or two and then read the last chapter. When I made my book reports, the teacher that did the grading said it was the best one she had ever had on that book. The day of graduation I was talking to her, after I got my prize, and told her how I had done it. She said she should take the prize away from me, but it was still the best report she had ever had on it. I had taught myself to speed read and my roommate would fuss about it. Sometimes I would read 2 or 3 books in a day of the lighter reading material and he couldn't do it. He still beat me. He spent almost all his working life as a school teacher. Maybe I should have spent more time studying. Every spring about Easter time, we would have our spring vacation, 3-day weekend. I would usually take an extra week and help Dad get the crop started. In the spring of the end of my freshman year, while I was home the extra week, old Shorty kicked me on my right leg, just below the knee, and it damaged the bone and a bone tumor began to develop. By the next spring, it was large enough that it was shutting off the circulation, so it was decided that I had to have an operation to remove it. Mrs. Downs, our school nurse, made an appointment for me at Springfield Baptist Memorial Hospital for Monday after school was out. She drove me up and dropped me off outside the hospital, and I had to go in and sign in, go through the operation and wait 4 days before seeing a familiar face. I believe that was one of the most lonesome times in my life. An odd thing about this was that about 10 years before I was there, the girl, Violet Fry, was in the same hospital and we think the same room for an operation on her left leg, the same as mine and by the same surgeon. After 4 days in the hospital, the nurse picked me up and took me back to S0. I stayed there for a few days and went home to recuperate. Dad had made me a pair of crutches out of a couple of saplings. We could not buy crutches, so Dad just went into the woods and found a couple of saplings with a fork kit about the right height to make the part for the piece that carries the pad for the top and also the hand hold. He had no special tools. He used his pocket knife to cut it all down close to size and then finished them by scraping with broken glass, and he did a very good job on them. I do not recall what finally happened to them. The second or third day at home, I rode my crutches into the field where they were stacking piles of oats. After standing around for a while, I laid the crutches down and went to work. I was supposed to stay off the leg for a week and then start putting a small amount of pressure on it. For the rest of the time I was at S0, every time the doctor would come down, he would send for me for an examination, and each time I would ask him what I owed, and each time he would say, "We would just wait a while." On the day of graduation, he was there and he sent for me again. He was using Dr. Good's office and his nurse was in Mr. Good's secretary's office. After he examined me, I asked him again how much I owed and he told me to see his nurse as I went out. She gave me an envelope which, when I opened it, had a congratulatory message in my bill cancelled. I was going back in to thank him and the nurse said no, that he would prefer that we just let it pass. He'll never know how I appreciated that. I did have to work out my hospital bill after graduation. Seems like it was $40 some odd. People who do that sort of thing deserve a special medal of some sort. I believe that is just another indication of how almost everybody feels about S0 in that part of the country. It is their school and they look out for it and the students there, and to a large degree, they still do. I think that is unusual and says a lot about the type of people involved with the school. By graduation time, Violet Fry and I had decided we would get married and tackle the old world together. Upon graduation, she went to Presbyterian Hill, summer resort across the lake at Branson, and I stayed at S0 to work out my hospital bill. 2 or 3 nights a week I would walk over to see her. After I had my bill paid, the school got me a job at a local pottery manufacturer helping to make pottery. We worked 8 hours a day and every night they would pay us $2 for 8 hours. Later on in the summer, I got a chance to come to Kansas City and go to work for the National Manufacturing Company in their shipping department. I had to borrow part of the money for my ticket from Violet. I wonder if I ever paid her back. My brother, Fred, worked at National as a machinist and electrician, and the shipping clerk was another S0 graduate. Corbin Clarkson, everybody called him Smokey. I worked at this company for about a couple of years and left because of labor problems. My next job was as redcap at the Union Station. At that time there were 96 to 98 trains through the station every 24 hours. That was a very interesting job. You had to be able to get along with all types of people. The distressful part was, it was at this time World War II was getting underway and there were so many people, including entire families, that were moving out of the Ozarks and going west to work in the defense plants, or young ladies going to see their husbands or boyfriends before they went overseas, and also a lot of elderly couples going to see a son for the same reason. You could tell the majority of them had never ridden a train before, and the size of the Union Station and the mass of people would just amaze them, and they would have to have help in being sure they made the correct connection out of the station. As the old saying goes, I could write a book about that if I had the ability to do so. Violet had come to Kansas City sometime after I did and went to work in a home in what is now Fairway, Kansas. My brother, Fred, and his wife, Irma, lived in the top of a duplex at 3225 McGee Street, and I was staying with them. Violet and I decided we would get married and get our own place, so on October 15, 1939, my brother drove us to Olathe, Kansas on a Sunday afternoon, and we were going to be married by the marrying Judge Rogers, the father of movie star Buddy Rogers. He was married to Mary Pickford, movie star. When we got there he had died that morning and no ceremonies were being done. We went back the next Sunday, October 22, 1939, and another judge did the officiating. Violet continued to work for a while and I stayed on with Fred and Irma. The first night that Violet and I were together, we slept on an army cot. Try that sometime. Later in the fall of 1939, we moved to an upstairs apartment located at 808 West 29th Street, Kansas City, Missouri. We had 3 rooms and bath and an outside porch, and the rent was $8 per month, and we used a coal stove for heat. My wages at that time were $16 per 40-hour week. I had a promotion on my job that winter and became the shipping clerk instead of a helper. The company I worked for was National Manufacturing Company, located at 2800 Mercier Street, Kansas City, Missouri. We didn't own an automobile, so if we couldn't bum a ride, we walked. In fact, there were several times when we would walk downtown and window shop, and like all newlyweds, we would build our dream home from what we would see displayed. Sometime in 1940 we moved to 2615 Oak Street into a duplex. We lived downstairs and had 3 rooms. Fred and Irma, my brother and his wife, lived upstairs. Later, my sister, Eva, and her husband moved into one of the upstairs rooms, so we had a full house, but we felt like it was a big improvement. We had a coal furnace rather than a stove. We would have some friends over fairly often on Saturday night for card games, and they would usually last until breakfast time. The couples were usually John and Ruth Brown, Joe and Mary Collier, and Fred and Irma. It was while we were at this address that I had to quit my job at National due to jealousy from a couple of people who kept wanting to interfere in the shipping department. Mr. Leonard, the owner, kept trying to get me to come back. He would talk to my wife and try to get her to talk me into coming back. He would also tell my brother Fred, who still worked there, to tell me he would raise my wages if I would come back. He kept offering me raises until he would have doubled what I was making. I suppose I was stubborn, but my theory has always been that you spend too much of your life working for it not to be something you could enjoy doing. After walking the streets for a job, I even spent some time wrapping packages for the Jones store downtown. I got on as a red cap at the Union Station, where I worked a split and swing shift, for the work was interesting and I got to meet some famous people, mostly movie stars. While living at 2615 Oak, and while I was still working as a shipping clerk, Violet became pregnant. In those days very few people had hospitalization, and we were in that group, so we began to save our dimes. Violet went to the clinic at Bell Memorial Hospital for her checkups. By streetcar. Bell Memorial Hospital is now part of the Kansas University Hospital. Violet entered the hospital the early morning of April 8, 1941. But things moved sort of slow, so I worked all day and came by the hospital when I got off work, and they told me it would be another hour or 2, so I went on home and cleaned up and ate, but Fern didn't wait that long. When I got back to the hospital, she was there. Seems like the hospital kept them for about a week, and I went to get them. I paid the hospital bills with dimes, $40 worth. One of the best investments we ever made. In 1941 or 1942 we bought our first car, a 1930 Model A Ford, which was the worst car I believe I have ever seen. You couldn't keep it in the road, the clutch was about out of it, and other numerous complaints, so we took it back to the guy and traded for a 1934 Oldsmobile for a lot more money, though. I think it was $140. Of course it was a lot nicer car, even a 4-door. Burl, my sister Iva's husband, and I took it for a road test after we bought it. We went out through Rosedale and on to Shawnee, Kansas. I drove it out and he drove it back. We were really winging it out coming back on Southwest Boulevard, and it started knocking something awful. We liked to have not got it back home. I jumped on the guy I had bought it from, but to no avail, for I had bought it as is. Not having any money to get it overhauled, Fred and I decided to do it ourselves, so we put it in the garage and started tearing it down. When we took the rod bearing caps loose, the bearings had been shimmed up with Prince Albert cans. Anyway, we had to do a major overhaul on it. That was my first mechanical experience, and I have to admit it, but it was probably the best overhaul I ever did. We had a next-door neighbor that was a shop foreman for GMC truck, and he helped me a lot, and then he began to pressure apprentice mechanic. The idea was mechanical work, but I was making me to go to work for them as an interesting, for I found I liked more as a red cap, especially when I figured in my tips. The more he talked and I thought about it, the more I wanted to do it. I finally decided that I was too young to stay in a dead-end job, for there wasn't much to work for as a red cap. Finally, after we talked about it a lot, I decided to do it, so I started on a 4-year apprenticeship. I never did get it finished, for Uncle Sam sent me a letter stating, "You have been selected," so in January of 1944 I became a sailor, went to boot camp in Farragut, Idaho, One of the most awful places you have ever seen, especially weather-wise. The story was that the Indians called it Fever Valley and wouldn't live there due to the variations in the weather. I was lucky in that after boot camp I got a chance to go to school at the Ford Motor Company in Dearborn, Michigan. It was what they called a basic engineering course. We studied about mechanics, electricity, plumbing, and spent about half of our time working in the machine shop. It was an extremely tough course. We took the same course in 16 weeks that the Ford apprentices did in 4 years. I was in school at Dearborn when our second daughter, Barbara, was born, and I couldn't get any time off. The base commandant said if she had an emergency and it lasted for 3 days I could get leave. I didn't like that, but not much I could do about it. If Barbara had been born about 3 weeks later, I would have been in Richmond, Virginia, in diesel school, and I would have automatically got 5 days as soon as they heard about it. I got another bad break from the school there. I finished third in the class out of about 160 men, and the first 2 men spent their entire Navy time as instructors in a Navy diesel school. After finishing the diesel school at Richmond, Virginia, we were sent to Solomons, Maryland for what they called a fleet service school. That was an interesting situation. The base was built to house somewhere around 15 to 20,000, and there was close to 40,000 men there. When it came time to go to bed, you took your cot and started looking for a place to set it. Wherever there was room to unfold it, that's where you slept that night. After we had been there 2 or 3 weeks, I got my assignment to an LCT crew. LCT landing craft tank, only we called it a low-crawling target. As soon as the crew was assembled, we were assigned to one for training. That was a rough time. We worked about 15-20 hours a day. We had to learn how to operate everything, practice steering a compass course for both night and day sailing, practice night landings under blackout conditions. I recall one night we were practicing blackout beaching and 2 aircraft were evidently practicing night firing, and somebody must have got their wires crossed, for all of a sudden there were tracer bullets ricocheting all around us. We broke all records for speed in getting our spotlight on and shining up in the air. Another time we were running compass courses and had finished our last run. There was a river that dumped into Chesapeake Bay, and the skipper decided we would go up it a ways to sightsee. We must have gone several miles, and the cars on the highway that paralleled the river were all parking to see us. Soon we came to a bridge that wasn't tall enough for us to go under, so we had to turn around and go back out. We were close enough to the people on the road that we were talking with them. I've wondered since what their thoughts were about what we were doing there. We would train for 3 weeks and then get a 72-hour pass. On our first pass, I went into Washington, D.C. I got me a sleeping room just a few blocks from the Union Station. I went to bed about 7 p.m. that night, and about the middle of the next afternoon I went out to eat and came back and went to sleep. About 9 a.m. the next day, the landlady woke me up and wanted to know if I was okay. She said service guys didn't normally spend that much time sleeping, and I told her if they had been working 15 to 20 hours a day as I had, they would want to sleep. After we finished about 6 to 8 weeks of training, they figured we were ready to go, so they sent us to New Orleans, Louisiana to get our ship and finalize our training before going overseas. While we were there, Violet, Fern and Barbara came down to spend the weekend. That was the first time I had seen Barbara. She was about 10 weeks old. They will never know how I appreciated them making that, for it was awfully hard on them. All the trains were packed and they had to ride in chair cars, and I know it was tremendously hard on them. Somewhere around the middle of October, we got our LCT landed topside on an LST, landing ship tank, and headed down the Gulf of Mexico heading for the Panama Canal. The first night about 2 a.m., the general quarters alarm sounded and everybody had to get up and go to their assigned station. They said they had picked up an unidentified submarine, but nothing happened. While we were going through the canal, one of our crew had an attack of appendicitis and his appendix had to be removed. We never did hear how he came out. When we started through the canal, we were supposed to be on the way to Hawaii, which everyone was looking forward to, but upon clearing the canal, a harbor patrol boat came alongside and our destination was changed to the New Hebrides Islands. We had been underway for 2 or 3 days when one of the ships in the convoy lost a man and we saw our first burial at sea. That is an impressive ceremony. All ships are stopped dead in the water. Flags are lowered to half-mast, taps are sounded and the body is slid over the rail. I believe that was the first time that we had it demonstrated to us just where we were and just how serious the situation was. We went 28 days without seeing land. Imagine if you can, an old farm boy from Arkansas who had never seen any more water than the Missouri River going that long and seeing nothing but water and the other ships in the convoy. On the 31st day since leaving the canal, we tied up at Espiritu Santos, New Hebrides. I would have liked to have been able to have taken pictures of us trying to walk on land after walking on the rolling decks for a month. Aboard ship, when you put your foot down, especially in rough weather, you put it down rather firmly for the deck might roll away from it, the ground doesn't. We spent 2 or 3 days on New Hebrides and then moved on to Hollandia, New Guinea. From there we went to Manus in the Admiralties. We spent 2 or 3 days there. While we were there, I found out later that my brother, Estel, and a man I had known for 10 to 15 years was also there, but none of us knew it at the time. My brother spent his overseas time there. He was also in the Navy. As a point of interest, as far as I was able to find out, I was the first one from either side of my parents' families to enter any branch of the services other than the Army. Something that impressed me about the islands we stopped at was that almost everyone had a Catholic missionary post. After we left Manus, we were sent to Leyte in the Philippines where we were launched. The LCT was not considered a seagoing ship and they were transported to their overseas destination mounted to the top deck of an LST. The launching was rather interesting. An LCT is 36 foot wide and 120 feet long, and to launch it, the LST was made to list to one side and then the chains, cables, etc. which hold the LCT aboard were cut loose and it just slid off and into the water. Speaking of a ship listing, we were told an LST was supposed to be able to take a 450 roll without flipping over. A few days out of the canal, we hit some very rough water and did several 480 rolls. The reason we didn't flip was due to the load it was carrying in its hold. Most of the load was bags of food, beans, coffee, sugar, etc., and very little large items. While we were in Leyte, we had our first air raid. Needless to say, we were scared. Some 10 years or so ago, I had a customer that was born in a small village just up in the mountains from the harbor. I believed it was called Tacloban. We had many interesting conversations. Every few years, he would go back home, and when he came back he would come by the shop and give me a report on all the changes that had taken place. We left Leyte and moved up to Subic Bay. When we anchored in the harbor at Subic, they told us we were 500 miles inside Japanese territory. Naturally, we appreciated hearing that. There were 36 LCTs and one old freighter in our convoy. The largest gun we had was 20 mm anti-aircraft one, but the old freighter had a 3-inch, so we felt good about that, although we found out later that it hadn't been fired in years. We waited about 2 weeks before the invasion fleet came in. When we went into Subic there really wasn't anything there, a piece of a house at what was called Olongapo, not sure of the spelling, and a few grass shacks. I suppose now it is our largest overseas Navy base. While we were waiting for the invasion, time got heavy on our hands and we looked for something to do. We noticed some small monkeys playing in the trees on the beach, so one morning, myself and a couple of my shipmates decided we would go monkey hunting. So we armed ourselves pretty good and rode over to the shore and started our chase. There was a winding road up the hill from the bay leading to Clark Air Force Base. It was called Zigzag Pass. We crossed the road several times during the day and would stop and hold target practice occasionally. We never did catch a monkey. We no doubt were watched all day by the Japanese, for when the invasion began, it took the Filipino guerrillas about 6 months to clean them out of the pass. We were foolish, I suppose, but we needed something to do. The first building that was done at Subic was a place where the submarine guys could come ashore and soak up some sunshine. We hauled the first load of material to start it and beached with it early one morning. After the territory around Subic was fairly well secured, we were sent to do salvage work to Cavite, which is just across the harbor from Manila. On our way down, we saw Corregidor Island with all the parachutes of our paratroops hanging everywhere. We were the first Navy craft to go to Cavite and created quite some excitement among the natives when we went into beach. The first day we were there, our forces had freed the prisoners held in the university by the Japanese, and they brought one of them to visit his family before going aboard a hospital ship. We could hear the fighting in a hotel in Manila. We were on the first floor and the Japanese were on the second floor. We cruised through the harbor at Manila, which was a distressing sight with all the sunken ships and planes sticking up out of the water. No larger than we were, we had to do a lot of maneuvering to make it. We spent about 8 or 9 months in Subic. The invasion of Japan was to be the next move and we were getting ready for it. We had extra guns and ammunition loaded, and we even had charts of where we would land on Japan. We knew what our load would be and what time we were to hit the beach when the big blast was set off, and it was over, a day none of us will ever forget. We were sent from Subic to Peking, China, but we never got there. They sent us by way of Okinawa, and while we were there, October 1945, one of the worst typhoons they had ever had hit, and when it was over, they were playing a softball game between us and the water, and they were just going to leave it there and break the crew up as replacements, which we didn't like as we had been together all the way. We finally talked them into REFLOading us. We only had 2 small holes which we had welded up. After we got back out in the water, they sent us to Incheon, Korea, to work in the occupation forces hauling materials of all sorts from the ships to shore. They were moving a lot of personnel back to Uncle Sugar, and my time finally came. I left my ship December 7, 1945, and headed home. What a day. Our troop ship pulled into the harbor at Seattle, Washington on Christmas Eve. That was a day I will never forget. The docks were loaded with people, bands were playing, ice cream and milk vendors were everywhere. Milk. Seems like everyone was really thirsty for it. Christmas dinner on shore was really something. We had been eating canned and dehydrated food for months. A bed to sleep in that didn't try to rock you to sleep. There had been a rock and snow slide east of Seattle in the mountains that had closed the railroad, and we had to wait for 2 weeks for it to be opened. The wait was easier to take, for we were made to feel like VIPs both aboard base and by the civilians we met. When the railroad was cleared, they loaded us aboard what had to be one of the oldest chair cars in railroad history. It still had the coal stoves at each end of the cars, although they didn't use them. It took us 5 nights and 4 days from there to St. Louis, but there wasn't too much complaining. For example, I called home about 9:30 one evening from St. Joseph, and we didn't reach St. Louis until the next afternoon. When I got my discharge and came home, Barbara was in the hospital in isolation, and the only way I could see her was through the window, and she didn't know who I was. Even when she came home, she didn't believe I was her daddy. If you mentioned it, she would point to my picture made while I was in boot camp. I went back to work at GMC Truck, but I soon could see that it wasn't going to work, for in their eyes I would always be an apprentice, and all my training in the Navy had been on diesels, but they wouldn't let me work on them at GMC Truck. So after a few months, I quit and went to work in a small shop where it was just me and the owner. Then I worked for a dealer for a while, for I wasn't satisfied. I answered an ad for a man to do instruction. After teaching for about a year, I quit and went into partnership with one of my students, an older man. We had a filling station and garage in Mission, Kansas, known as Mission Standard. That lasted for about a year and was a disaster for both of us. His name was James Livingston, really a nice and honest man, but it just didn't work out. When we broke up the partnership, I went back to teaching and taught for another 5 or 6 years. By 1952, the enrollment was down so low at the school that we only had a 6-hour class each day, and at $2 per hour just was not enough. There was 5 of us now. Howard was born in 1947. I was still interested in my own business. We talked a lot about it. In 1952, the name of Adams Auto Electric was born in October or November of that year. I rented space in the rear of an auto supply at 3612 Indiana and Kansas City, Missouri. The auto parts was Cato Auto Supply. I was still teaching 6 hours per day. We moved the business from the Indiana address, I believe, to the address of 2207 East 31st Street. In a year or so, I had built the business to where I was working from 12 to 15 hours a day between the 2 jobs, so we decided that one of them had to go. We rented space at 2016 East 31st Street. It would hold 3 cars by some maneuvering, and I quit the teaching. We were either full of confidence or naive, for when we got the utilities on and the first and last month's rent paid, between us, we had $12 and some change. The next 2 or 3 years were some of the hardest times we ever went through. I worked some awfully long hours, for if there was a job in to do, I would stay until it was finished, because getting that one done would mean we would have a little money. Many nights I would come home calling myself all sorts of a fool for hanging on. I knew it wasn't fair to the kids, the wife, or me, and determined to get out the next day and get a job, but in the morning, I would tell myself, one more day. So we hung on. About 1964, we moved the shop to a Sinclair service station located at Linwood and Oak in Kansas City, Missouri. Another one of the many mistakes I made. We hung on at the station until 1967. We now had 4 children. Bonnie was born in 1959. She was a replacement for Fern when she got married, but we decided not to keep that up as the others got married. On New Year's Day, we moved the business from Linwood and Oak to 4900 East 31st Street, Kansas City, Missouri. We rented for a year with an option to buy. We started buying the shop in 1968 and had a two-stall addition built on in 1969 and 1970 and settled in for the duration. I owe a tremendous amount to my wife and children. I don't know how they stood by me through all the rough years. I worked such long hours I could not be a good parent or husband. I missed so much as they were growing up, not being able to enter into their activities. I hope they will forgive me for all those. I loved them very much and was trying to build something for all of us. I would never have been satisfied if I had not tried to make it on my own. In some ways, my working life has been unusual in that in so much of it I have been in the position of not being responsible for just myself. In high school I had to be responsible a lot of times for what others did. When I was a red cap I was given the responsibility of helping train new ones. In the Navy I was in charge of all the mechanical aspects of the ship. Then I spent 7 years teaching, then my own business. So I look back with mixed emotions. I enjoyed the challenges, but it seemed like I could never get the proper balance between the work and family side of it, but I have appreciated very much the support of my wife and children. Just an afterthought, there seems to be an idea developing that seems to somewhat degrade a person that makes his living from what is known as working with your hands. I always believed that the hands did what the mind directed them to do. Now that I have said all of that, permit me to meander some, maybe make some sense and nonsense. Every generation has a lot of slots it must fill as it has to furnish replacements for all the people who pass away or retire, but not only those slots but people to do the research and experiments necessary to discover new fields and new inventions to keep our way of life growing and to furnish the jobs to keep our people working and having longer productive lives with fewer physical problems. As of the 29th of August, 1990, I will have been occupying space on this planet for 70 years. I am amazed at the advancements I have seen in that space of time and how little I have learned. As I mentioned before, I can recall the first radio I ever heard, and now there is practically instant worldwide communication, wrist radios, and even a small television set that will almost fit in the palm of your hand. The first pictures I can recall being snapped, it was a major undertaking. Everybody had to be perfectly still as it took quite some doing to get the camera focused. Now we have Polaroid cameras that will give you your picture in a moment or so, other cameras that you just aim and shoot and it adjusts the shutter and focusing on its own, camcorders that you can take movies and view them as you take them, then insert the film in VCR and project it onto the screen of your television. When you think about that, it is almost a miracle. The advances in medicine, as they say, boggle the mind. Insulin for diabetes is close to my age now. A diabetic can make their own blood sugar tests in a matter of seconds and adjust their insulin as needed. Doctors can take the organs from one person and transplant them to another person. They use a balloon to open clogged arteries, replace joints, and even limbs with man-made materials. Even babies born without arms and legs can be fitted with electronic replacements which they can learn to manipulate. From the Model A Ford, which was the first car I rode in and had just the barest essentials, to ones that are loaded with computers that control the engine's necessary functions, from the Model T Ford that it has been said made every owner of one a mechanic, to today's car that if it stalls on you, you almost have to have it towed to a shop equipped to diagnose the problem. Haven't heard of a psychiatrist having a couch for one yet, I'm waiting. Aviation has gone from mostly single open cockpits to ones that carry hundreds of people across the ocean, and according to statistics they are the safest mode of travel we have. We have spaceships that can take people there and bring them back, to the moon no less. I remember once not long after we had landed men on the moon and brought them back that I was out at the farm one night and Mom was out in the yard staring up in the sky. I looked and all I could see was the moon, so I asked what she was looking at and she said, "I don't believe that a man was ever up there." I almost had to agree with her. Most people under 40 to 50 years old have been in at the beginning of a lot of these advancements, but some of us older loggerheads find it somewhat confusing. Will there be as much advancement in the next 70 years? I wouldn't say no, but I don't believe that the advancements will occur with the same rapidity. Can you imagine the fact that until I went to S0 in 1935, I had never seen an electric light, a flush toilet, a shower, or a drinking fountain? That I never had tasted a malted milk until after I was married? Think about it. I have always tried to read about our progress through the years, and in my profession I felt that I was well informed, but with the speed of the improvements in automobiles in the last 15 to 30 years, I almost felt like the manuals said, you learn more and more about less and less, and that you finally reach the point where you know all there is to know about nothing. I believe what I am trying to say in all of this is that it's a fast-changing world and you will need to learn all you can about these changes. The social and political changes are tremendous. It has almost reached a point where politician is a dirty word that is not good. I am not a politician, but I do know that everyone needs to use their right, and obligation, to vote on all elections, from the local to the White House and everything in between. There is also an obligation on the part of the voter to become informed on the issues and people involved. Years ago I read where some man stated that we can have the type of government that the majority of the people want if they will just express those desires in the voting booth. I would suggest to all of you to learn all you can about the issues and the people running for elective office, and then exercise that freedom in the voting booth. If there are children born, cherish them, nurture them, and train them for the temptations facing them as they grow up. It is scary when I think of the different factions that are pulling at people today, things that were never heard of when I was growing up. Much of this can only be overcome by education and by a very strong moral background, and a lot of the education must come from the home. You cannot assume they will learn the things they must know somewhere else. Stay close to them and gain their trust so they know as they grow they can always come to you with their problems. As the saying goes, keep the lines of communication open. I would also suggest more reading. I believe everyone should read at least one new magazine as well as your local newspaper. With the upheaval worldwide, we owe it to ourselves to try to keep informed. I believe everyone should read at least 30 minutes a day. If you do for a while, I'll wager that before long it will be longer. We still learn far more by reading than any other way. Mark Twain is reported to have said that a good reader is someone who can read, understand, and inwardly digest the printed word. Everyone should try to work out a reading schedule of their own, mix it up, some inspirational, some informational, and some just for the joy of reading. I would also suggest regular church attendance, for we all will profit from that, and you will learn things that will help you to better control your life and those you are responsible for. I read once where someone said that we should work today as if we would live forever and live today as if we would die tomorrow. I believe that would make a good motto, don't you? Today almost everyone you talk to complains about the problems they have with the treatment they get from their business dealings. My philosophy in my business was to make sure every job was done to the best of my ability, and normally on every job I would do some small job that wasn't on the order and never mention it to the customer. I have had many of them come back to thank me or give me a call. Well, enough meandering. Some of what I talked about I know I did it very poorly, but I hope you know my intentions were good. As they say, you have to take a Dutchman by what he means, not what he says. I love every one of you and love to watch you grow and develop your lives and careers. Love you all. Grandpa. I am not a writer, but I hope you find some points of interest and some things to make you think about. We can't get away from our roots, and I would hope that all of you develop some interest in the outdoors and things found in nature. I feel fortunate in many ways that I grew up in a time before everything was so automated, when you had an opportunity to become very involved in everything concerned with your life. I also know there were many disadvantages to living that way, but I feel like we were more aware of each other and each other's needs and helping to find solutions to different problems. Families were much closer and more dependent on each other. By giving you this now, while I'm still around, if any of you have any questions or comments, I would just be mighty pleased to talk about it with you. Also, I would enjoy taking any of you back to that area and show you around. I would love to see all of you get better acquainted with each other. Maybe this can work as something to give you a common connection. The family is an important part of all of our lives, and there are times in a person's life that family becomes very important. I have enjoyed very much doing this, but parts of it dredges up memories that you thought you had pushed out of your mind. We have a tendency to forget the bad things that have happened to us, and maybe sometimes it is good to bring them back out and think about them. I suppose as we get older we have a tendency to live more and more in the past because we have a lot more of that than we do of the future. Try to fill your lives with as many good things as you can, so when you reach the remembering time in your life that you will have lots of good ones. Informational notes. History of business. Opened as part-time business October 1952, 3612 Indiana, Kansas City, Missouri. Moved to 2207 East 31st Street, Kansas City, Missouri in 1954 or 1955. Moved to $2J6 East 31st Street, Kansas City, Missouri in 1956 or 1957 and expanded to full-time. Moved to Linwood and Oak, Kansas City, Missouri, and operated a Sinclair service station. Moved to 4901 East 31st Street, Kansas City, Missouri on January 1, 1967. Sold the business and retired in July 1985. My brother Ed is buried in the Britton Cemetery, just off highway about 1/4 mile west of the turnoff for Alvey, Arkansas. My brother Fred is buried at Gentry, Arkansas. Both my parents are buried in Floral Hills Cemetery, Kansas City, Missouri.